Hi everyone, welcome to tonight's session. I apologize, we're a couple of minutes getting started. People have been filtering in and we are, I think most people have made it into the live session tonight. So welcome to everyone. We are here tonight with the topic of individualized education plans, partners and individual student success. What I'm going to do is introduce the people that are going to present tonight. Just give me a second and I will. First I have Cindy Smith. Cindy Smith is a special needs consultant. Hi Cindy. She's a special needs consultant with the Pontiac schools and she'll be presenting tonight. And we have Andrea Mayu. And Andrea is a special needs consultant for the schools in the Aylmer region. So those are two of our consultants who work with our school board and work with the school teams to support your children. So myself, I am, sorry, oh, I know what I need to do. Apologies. You can't see what I'm doing. The PowerPoint back up. Sorry. And I am Lisa Falasconi. I'm the Director of Complementary Services for Western Quebec. So it's nice to, I would like to say it's nice to see all of you, but in this format, I can't actually see those of you on the screen. So what we'll do is get started now. I think we've got everybody in. So tonight's presentation, what I'm going to do is do a little bit of housekeeping to make sure that everything is clear and that we have, we're using a slightly different format of Teams tonight. It is what is called a live presentation and a live event is done a little differently. So these are some of the points regarding the presentation. First of all, the presentation will be recorded and is being recorded as we speak and will be made available after the session. As this is a live event through Teams, your mic and camera have been automatically disabled for the presentation. And a question and answer period will follow the presentation. I'll go into that a little bit more detail in the next slide. No personal information or queries will be addressed tonight as this is a public and recorded forum. Thank you for your attendance at tonight's session, and once again the presenters are noted below. So Cindy and Andrea and myself presenting on behalf of Complementary Services. So for those of you who may or may not be accustomed to or have worked with Teams, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of information about how you can interact with us. Up in the top right hand corner of your screen, you should see, depending on the format or the technology that you're using, we've noted that if you're using a tablet, you may see something slightly different than those who are using a phone or a laptop. So depending on what you see on your screen, for those on a laptop, it would be at the top right-hand corner of your screen. You would see a variety of different icons to select. So on the screen here or on this slide, you'll see that there's a chat function. That is apparently, I believe it is disabled for this event, so we don't seem to have access to the chat function unless maybe some of you can see it. Participants, I don't believe that you will see any names there because everybody joins on as a guest, so it's anonymous. The next one is the question and answer, and that is the section in which we would be interacting with each other, and we'll be having a Q&A later on in the session. The three dots or the ellipses are a way to actually interact so that you can see the presentation in a different way. There is live captions that you can activate so that you can read as you're also listening to the presentation. Once again, you have the camera and the mic, which are likely disabled, and then there's the leave for when you are leaving the session tonight. So to send a question during the presentation, and I would encourage you to send them during the presentation. You do not have to wait till the end of the session. You would click on the Q&A icon and you will have the option to send a question. You can identify a name if you want, or you can just leave it anonymous. At the end of the session, so as we accumulate those questions over the presentation, we will compile them and try to group them and answer as many as we can during the Q&A at the end. If we don't get a chance to answer all the questions, we will try to address them in a future communication or a presentation in the future. So we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can tonight. The last piece is that we're going to have a feedback form. I'm going to put it up in the Q&A. I'm just going to do that. There's going to be a feedback form in the Q&A, and you will be able to, so if I go there right now, I'm going to just load in the, the form. So there should be an announcement there of a form that you would be able to complete so that we can actually generate some feedback about how we can improve for future presentations. We'll be able to also, in that form, you can ask questions that maybe you didn't get a chance to ask during the presentation, but that'll be available to you. So that's a little bit about Teams, and now we'll really get into the meat of the presentation now. Okay, so what is an individualized education plan? And so you'll often hear it termed as an IEP. That's the short form, and that's how most people refer to them. So in general terms, an IEP is a tool that's designed to support a student who has a special need, a social difficulty, a learning disability, or a difficulty. It supports coordinated action. It promotes collaboration and communication between the student, the school, parents, and outside services. It is a flexible working document that supports the development and progress of a student. So that's really, in a nutshell, if we look at what an IEP is, that's basically what we're talking about. The question comes, when should an IEP be developed? So the first bullet, or the blue section there, says that the situation is such that a more sustained and coordinated effort is needed. So in this bullet, really what we're looking at is that teachers have the flexibility to use a variety of strategies and tools with all of the students in their class. And we know that students progress in very individual ways and at different paces, at different developmental periods and ages. Differentiation or differentiated instruction is a part of every classroom, and that doesn't really require an IEP to be implemented. For students with diagnosed special needs or disabilities, an IEP is intended to outline and ensure coordinated and targeted strategies, adaptations, modifications, or even an alternate program that might be needed. When a child is experiencing difficulty, we want to intervene quickly, and so early intervention for learning or social difficulties allows a teacher to determine and target more specific strategies in order to determine their effectiveness. So if we look at the second bullet, specialized resources or adjustments are needed in addition to actions normally taken. So this is really focusing on the resources or adjustments. Excuse me. So when we're talking about this area here, we're looking at when it's appropriate. An IEP could include such things as special exam conditions. So those would be conditions that are necessary when a child is writing a ministry exam. And we would obviously prepare them during their years to be able to use those tools effectively. It might identify assistive tools that are necessary. It might look at technology and equipment that a student may need to allow them to participate to their full potential. Then if we looked at the third bullet, which reads that it is implemented only after many strategies and resources have been tried. So in the case of learning difficulties that may start to present themselves, what has to occur is the teacher needs to take the time to try out different strategies and interventions, and following those interventions after a period of time, if it's determined that a more coordinated or specific action is needed, then that is when we would look at an IEP. So that's kind of when an IEP should be developed. So if we look at the next the next slide, it's really about who is involved, who are the partners, who is a part of the team. The first square there, inevitably, this should be a circle, and the student should truly be in the center, but the student is at the center of the IEP process and is encouraged to be an active member in the IEP team. Unless, of course, that they are unable to do so, whether in terms of age or ability, maybe they aren't able to fully engage in that conversation, but students can always be a part of achieving and setting goals, smaller goals within the larger goal. So students can become a part of that process. Their contribution to the dialogue can be highly motivating for the student. If the student knows what they're trying to achieve, they themselves can actually motivate themselves further. So having them as an active partner is important. The next one to the right, being the parents and the guardians. You're obviously essential to that IEP process, and you're an integral support for your child. You know your child best, and we need to work together to ensure that we're addressing all the needs of your child. Then we have teachers. And so teachers may include a variety of different teachers. So there may be a main classroom teacher. At secondary, you may have subject teachers that may or may not be involved specifically with the creation of an IEP, but we all work together. So there's also specialist teachers who may be teaching option courses, things like that, that need to know how your child learns. And then we also have resource teachers. It's more specifically, they're referred to as remedial and supporting teachers. But in Western Quebec, you'll often hear the term resource teacher. And those are teachers who have, they are teachers, but they have additional duties, and they also have maybe more experience in terms of and training that we are providing to support students that have a variety of needs. The next bullet, which is school staff. A school staff may be involved. They're likely not directly involved with the writing of an IEP, but school staff can include those that are supporting your child in their schooling. So that could be technicians, it could be an attendant. And then we look at the principal. Now the principal is the person who is primarily responsible for the implementation of all IEPs in the school. And they may or may not be directly involved with contributing to the specific IEP of a child in the school, but they are definitely responsible for the overall implementation. Then we have complementary services, and those may include the professionals that work with your child, so a speech and language pathologist or a readaptation officer, and even possibly, like the two others that are presenting tonight, special needs consultants who may be able to consult with best practices and strategies for specific learning and social needs. Then there was we have other additional services, and when I'm talking about other additional services, what I'm really thinking about is those outside partners that may not be in the school all the time, but may be contributing to the support needed for your child. So that could be private therapists or private professionals working with your child, or even health and social services professionals who may be collaborating with the school to set goals. Maybe they have intervention plans on their own, and they can be a part of the IEP process. Now, all of these team members play a role in the development and the progress of the student, and the IEP is intended to promote that collaboration and communication that is needed to support this child. And I think what's important here is that each supporting member brings a different perspective and a different role. So depending on the individual student's needs, different partners may be involved in the IEP implementation process. It really depends on what the ultimate goal is for the child. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of who's involved. And so now I'm going to move over to, oh, I apologize if you can see me. I have my camera, my lights got dim all of a sudden, and it's because I didn't move in my office, and now the lights have just gone out. So I'm just going to turn it over to Andrea. Just give me a second here. I'm also the producer. So I'm going to. One more second. So Andrea here is going to, this is not her slide. There we go.
Thank you.
Sorry about that delay, Andrea.
No, not a problem. You've got many hats on this evening, so including producer. So, well, nice to see everybody virtually this evening. So the next slide really focuses on what guides the IEP. So there are many components that we would like to take into consideration when we're thinking about establishing an IEP. And at the forefront, it's really essentially looking at success in a different way, always placing the student at the center of the IEP, adopting a systemic view, focusing on students' strengths always, and of course the involvement of school, family, and community cooperation. That's an essential piece as well. So when we talk about seeing success in a different way, essentially what we're saying is that the IEP process really embraces the philosophy that educational success has different meanings depending on the abilities and needs of different students. So it's always important to consider this piece when we're discussing or perhaps we're initiating an IEP. And what do we mean when we say placing the student at the center of the IEP? We always have to remember that students have a wide range of needs, and the best response is one that's always adapted to the individual needs and abilities of a student, and in your case, your child. And also, in speaking to adopting a systemic view to the IEP is based on a systemic view, which essentially means that, we want to include personal information or personal factors, family factors, social and academic factors of the individual child and their unique situation. It's also implemented using a solution-centered approach. So we always want to take into consideration various environmental factors in order to make the necessary adaptations to perhaps and hopefully reduce or eliminate all the barriers that are perhaps key factors to the development of the student's competencies. And again, we always want to go back to focusing on a student's strength. So when we're developing an IEP or when you're involved in the process of initiating and developing the IEP, we always want to think about what can the child do independently, and then what would be the next step to help them move along, to move to the next level. And so we always think about what can they do, and then let's move on from there. And finally, the last piece in this slide, again, we're talking about the importance of school, family, and community cooperation. So all of these different individuals or outside contributors, there are key factors that we need to consider when we're establishing the IEP. And so those are all part of it. But perhaps most importantly, it is the parent participation. So parents are always going to be encouraged to attend an IEP meeting. So, your school will reach out to you at one point. Perhaps you're already well into the process, so you do know how this works. But if you're brand new to this process, that is a step that is very important, and you will be asked to participate. And so if it hasn't happened already, it will be happening shortly. And also a really big piece that I don't want to forget to mention is to really encourage a student to be part of the process when it's appropriate. It may not always be appropriate for a child to be involved, but the child can help to contribute to the development of the IEP, and therefore they become more accountable to the success of the IEP, and the IEP in turn becomes more meaningful to them. So we don't have really student listed here, but that was one piece I wanted to mention as well. So we can maybe move on to the next slide. So the IEP is really designed to meet the needs of the student's pathway. So in our school board, we have 3 different pathways that a student could be following. And therefore, there of course are 3 different types of IEPs that a student could have. So in case you're not familiar with the different pathways in our school board, I'll quickly kind of go over them tonight. So most students follow a regular pathway. And this type of pathway or program leads to your typical high school diploma, but we do also have other pathways. So one of the pathways you may or may not have heard of yet is a modified pathway. And so a modified pathway leads to a leaving certificate from the Ministry of Education. And students in this pathway, what's kind of unique with this program is that they will follow eventually they will follow a work-oriented training pathway, or more specifically a pre-work program, once they reach the age of 15. And what's unique about this program is that this offers students the ability to participate in more of a work/study program. And this eventually may lead to, it may lead actually directly to the job market upon completion of the program. And under some conditions, it may also lead to vocational training programs, or perhaps some students may continue their studies at adult education, or adult ed as we like to call it. And finally, the last program or pathway in our board is the life skills pathway. So we have 3 different categories within that program. So we have students who might either follow a CAS program or a Challenges. And then we also have the PII program, which is our Profound Intellectual Impairment students. But what's important to keep in mind is that this program is specifically for students who have been diagnosed by a professional with either a moderate to severe intellectual disability. So that would be the students in the CASP and the Challenges program. Or finally, the PII, or the Profound Intellectual Impairment. Students in this program would also have had to have been diagnosed by a professional, and they would have been formally diagnosed with a profound intellectual impairment. So depending on the pathway or the program that your child follows, the IEP will correspond directly to their individual program. So again, all of these will not apply to your specific child, but for the purpose of today's meeting, we just wanted to outline that there are different pathways and the IEPs do correspond in turn. So the next slide. Thanks, Lisa. So confidentiality. I know sometimes, and certainly Lisa and Cindy and I have all been part of meetings where sometimes, you know, there can be some trepidation or some concern on the part of a parent about confidentiality. So we just wanted to have a slide to really speak to this piece and the importance of it. It is our legal responsibility to ensure the confidentiality of the personal information we have for your child. So having said that, it's not just anybody who has access to your student's file. And also the documents are kept in a confidential file in a specific locked room in either the school or at the board office. So there are copies kept at your child's school, and there is also a copy kept at the board office. And the IEP just happens to be one of those confidential documents. So there is always a copy or a printed signed copy of your child's IEP at the school. And at the school board level, we can access it electronically. And again, just to reiterate, school team members who work with your child may have access to this information if and only if it impacts the support that they provide for your child. So once again, it's not everybody who has access to the information in the file, it's only those specific adults who work with your child. And the confidential file does transfer from school to school within the Western Quebec School Board as necessary. So for example, if you have, let's say your child attends Pete's or Greater Gatineau, and then they happen to move maybe more to the Elmer region, and maybe now they're attending a school such as Erdley or Lord Elmer. there's nothing for you to do. That information does transfer from school to school, and once again, it is the legal responsibility to ensure the confidentiality, even if it moves from school to school. And there are, as we noted, there can be many documents in the confidential file. If ever there was a report such as a speech and language report or a psychoeducational report or other, we would request, or the school would request, that a release of information is signed in order for us to obtain documents or send documents to another individual or an institution. So none of this can happen without your consent. So we do value confidentiality. It's one of the main pieces that we wanted to really kind of share, to reassure people that these documents, there is a process, and they are kept safe at the board and not shared with any individual who does not work with your child. And I'll move on to the next slide. So those of you who are familiar or who are getting familiar with the IEP process, you've probably heard of SMART goals, and typically most students who have an IEP will have 2 SMART goals that are developed for them. And as you can see, there is an acronym. That's why we call them SMART goals. So the goals are strategic and specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're results-based, and they're time-bound. So when we're thinking about the IEP, we always have to ask ourselves, why does the student have an IEP? So that should always be the first question when developing an IEP. And it's important to focus always on the next steps for the students. So if we're developing a SMART goal as a team, we always do think about it with that acronym in mind. So for example, if we're talking about strategic and specific, the goals really do need to be specific to that child. It should be geared to the student's needs. If we're talking about measurable, it means that we should be able to either count or observe the success of the goal or the goal itself, and it needs to be attainable. So that's why it's so important for parents to be involved in this process, because we always have to ask ourselves, is the goal appropriate, or even is it age appropriate? So we always make sure that the goal is not too frustrating, or it won't be too frustrating for the student. And so we make sure that the strategies are relevant and appropriate for the child or for the student. And what we mean by realistic or results-based or relevant, again, the goal should be realistic for the child in order for that child to be successful. And in our board, when we talk about time-bound, it's also on the slide, but we do assume that the goal, that the child should be successful in attaining that goal by the end of the year. And then we would be thinking in the spring of a new goal and how to help move that child along as they progress from year to year. And there are also communications. We should point that out. The communications are monthly. And the goal that we have to always keep in mind is that the intent of the communication is really to foster collaboration and perhaps address any difficulties if they do arise. Perhaps there's going to be 1 month where the communication, there won't be a lot to change or to add, but perhaps some difficulties, are starting to creep into the mix, and those might need to be addressed. And so those monthly communications are a great time to do that. And again, it's just building that communication between home and school, which is so important. And I should note too that the communications, the monthly communications, can look very different depending on the school or the teacher and depending on preference. So perhaps the communication could be in the format of an email or a phone call home, or many other different or various formats. But just for you to be aware that there is a communication process involved in the IEP as well. And so now I'm going to turn things over to Cindy Smith. And when Lisa, you get a moment, I'll get you to switch it. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Okay, so how do I contribute to my child's IEP? As a parent, you have a very important role in the creation, development, and monitoring of your child's IEP. It's a vital role because you are the constant in your child's life and will transition with your child through the various school grades as well. You can provide information about your child's strength and their needs. Go ahead. So, at the early stages, prior to beginning school or at registration, notify the school team of involvement with any outside services, professional reports, evaluations, or your child's particular needs. So this is particularly important if your child is just being registered to school or you're coming from a different location. It's very important that you contact the school and advise if there's any special evaluations or information that you would like to share with the school, because we like to know this information, so we like to have a plan in place so that when your child does start school, we're ready to accept them and things are put in place. So share reports or information about outside services with the school to help them better understand your child's strengths, abilities, and needs. So if you're new to the school, if this happens throughout the school year, information should be shared with the school. So once again, we can plan and put things in place for your child. Now, if your child is in school and has been maybe moving through the grades, seeing things seem to be okay, but then all of a sudden you think that there's a difficulty going on. So at the early sign of academic or social difficulty, notify your child's teacher of your concerns and interest in working together to improve the situation. So if you've noticed something at home, it's a good thing to notify the school and have a conversation with the teacher to see what they're seeing in the classroom. Oftentimes, there is sometimes a discrepancy between home and what's happening in the school. So it's important to work together and address the needs at that time. So the teacher at that point may have been talking about, differentiation going on in the classroom, and still seeing that, there may be some difficulties that are not being addressed. So it's at this time that an IEP may become part of the intervention, and that's when we're going to want to work together to collaborate to put a IEP plan in place. Okay, next. So, early implementation of the IEP. So you may be involved in the following ways. So it's important to collaborate with the school team because you know your child best, and we really want to know what strategies you're doing at home and what's working for your child. As much as possible, we really like to know what's working, and also what you notice doesn't work for your child, and discuss it with the school to see if we can put something in place that's going to meet your child's needs. So when you're collaborating with the school team, it's also important to consider the school observations and environments, because like I said earlier, sometimes what you see at home is not necessarily what they're seeing at school. The environments are very different. The classrooms can be very busy places. There's lots of needs going on in the classroom. It could be something simple as noise levels. It could be the pace sometimes. So it's very important to consider the school environment as well. So when you're collaborating with a teacher, these type of situations are going to be discussed, and you can try and figure out, how am I going to address the needs of my child? So provide input for the development of the IEP. All these strategies and all these scenarios are going to be discussed. Now, this could be discussed at meetings. So the school could call and suggest that they have a meeting to discuss the IEP, or as a parent, you also can call the school and suggest that you would like to have a meeting about your child's IEP because you want to bring things forward and you've noticed things that are, you would like to make some suggestions. So once you've met and collaborated together, and an IEP has been created, and you're happy with the goals that have been put in place, you're going to be asked to sign the final version of the IEP and consent to allow team members to have access. So prior to that, a draft copy will be sent home. You'll have the opportunity to look over it and make any suggestions before a final copy has been completed. Okay, now during the implementation stage of the IEP, so the IEP is in place for your child, so you can support the IEP, support the development of the goals with some at-home strategies. For example, the strategy could have been something with like a first then schedule. First the child completes this task, then the child's going to have a 5-minute break. These type of strategies can also be practiced at home. It could be something with a timing, we want your child to be able to attend for 5 minutes before we move on to the next task. These things can be supported at home as well. You can also contribute. You can contribute to ongoing communications related to your child's progress. So if you're noticing that your child has made leaps and bound gains in a certain area, that's important for you to let the school know that you've noticed that things have been going really well in this area. Or if you notice that there's been some difficulty lately surrounding a certain area, that's also important to contribute and explain to the school. So notify the school team of any changes or assessments during the course of the year. So there could be something privately going on, perhaps a speech and language assessment has been completed, perhaps your child has gone to the doctor and been diagnosed with something, or perhaps there's medication, perhaps there's something to do with vision, motor, anything like that. So it's important to notify the school of any changes or assessments during the course of the year. Next, Lisa. Okay, at the review stage. So now, Andrew had mentioned that normally with the IEP, the goals are set for the year. So periodically they're going to be reviewing the IEP to consider the progress that's been noted during the school year. So that's something for you as a parent to also consider. You can constantly be looking at the IEP to see, okay, have my child been making gains in this area? You can suggest maintaining, adjusting, or replacing goals as necessary. Perhaps your child has been doing much better. Maybe the reading has increased a lot, or maybe it could be fine motor skills and they made advancements. These things can be suggested to be changed or adjusted. As the school year goes on, at the end of the school year, we can also monitor the need for an IEP. If your child has made many gains and you were discussing with the teacher, perhaps the need for the IEP is no longer there and the IEP can be removed for the following year. Or if new goals want to be set, then we can collaborate on the development of a new IEP as necessary, all student-based in order to meet the needs of your particular child. Next, please.
Okay, so this is my portion here, and Cindy, I apologize because you're still on the screen. Just give me a second. There's a couple of steps to do. There we go. So the next slide is actually regarding support, and this section is really about where do you reach out if you need help. So if you need help and you aren't really sure about how to proceed, or you have a question, or something isn't going well in the classroom, where do you go? So number one is your child's teacher. So your child's teacher is the primary person who is directly involved with the student. So that is always your first contact. So the teacher needs to be the first contact because they're really the ones working most directly with the goals, with the learning, with the strategies, and they're really the ones that would have the most information in terms of how to move forward. The next point is the principal, and I had mentioned a little earlier that the principal has the primary responsibility for the establishment and implementation of the IEPs, and that there are other team members who can assist in the implementation of the IEP. But if for example, you're not, you've hit kind of a roadblock and you need some more help beyond working with your teacher, your child's teacher, the principal would be the next step. So the principal is the person who can help you in those cases. Beyond that, if difficulties would still continue, there is a process that we have within the school board. And this can look at review of the situation. And if there was a decision that wasn't necessarily made that you were in agreement with, and you've gone through the process, there is what's called the bylaw 18 that can be referred to seek additional support. I also noted here the special education policy. So we do have a special education policy with the school board. And I know you can't click on these links right now, but when this PowerPoint is made into a PDF, you'll be able to have the slides and you could click on those. But if you did want to look or consult either of these documents, they are available on our school board website under resources. Sorry, so I'm going to go to the next one, which is actually looking at IEP references. Much of what we've talked about today and other supporting information can be found at a couple of different, I put MEQ resources, and I apologize if I didn't make that clear, but that's the Ministry of Education of Quebec. And those would be a couple of documents that are really, really helpful tools. So one is called the Reference Framework for the Establishment of Individualized Education Plans. Now, you will notice that these two documents in themselves, one was written in 2004 and one was written in 1999. And you may think that they're very out of date. But to be honest, they're as valuable now as they were then, because they really look at what the environment needs to be for a student with special needs to ensure that they're able to meet their potential. So the first one, the reference framework, I'm just going to slide over to, there is a brief, which is basically a two-sided document that has a very, very simple explanation as to what the orientations are, why we develop one, when the IEP should be established, and who would be involved. So that's a helpful, at a glance document. So in that link, the first link, there is a pamphlet, an entire pamphlet. There's the brief, which I just showed you, and there's also a PowerPoint presentation that gives you a little bit of information as well. Adapting our schools to the needs of all students is actually this policy on special education, and the plan of action for special education is included there as well. And these two documents, like I said, if you don't look at the pictures of the individuals and the clothing that they're wearing and realize that it's 1999, the information is as relevant today as it was back then. So as I said, those were some of the documents that I thought would be helpful for parents. I'll just move forward. And another resource I wanted to highlight is one we have at the Western Quebec School Board, the Special Education Advisory Committee, and so referred to as SEAC, all these acronyms. But the SEAC committee worked last year and collaborated to create a toolkit. So this is a tool that may assist you as parents in the IEP process. So once again, it is on the website. If you look up individualized education plans or IEPs, you would be able to find it under resources. But this guide is actually, it's 3 documents. One, it is the guide, which kind of gives you an overview of the whole process and your role within that IEP process. And the last 2 documents are actual documents. So they are templates, checklists, questionnaires that can help guide your discussion. So if you want to have kind of a document to walk into an IEP, meeting with and you aren't really sure what you need to bring, these tools could potentially help you generate some ideas about what the strengths and challenges are for your student and how you see the barriers in the educational system and where we can address those. So I would encourage you, those are some resources that were developed last year and are available on the website. So I'm going to look now at the questions. So while we were presenting, I started to look at some of the questions. At this point, Cindy and Andrea, I can't, oh my goodness, the light went out. I end out in the dark. These questions, I've taken a few of them. You've been sending them in, that's great. And I thought we could address some of them that we've got to date to this point. I haven't read them all, but I thought maybe we could take the next 10, 15, 20 minutes to answer the questions that we can during this time. So just catch my breath. The first question that I had, so I had, there was a question here related to when an IEP includes accommodations for anxiety or mental health issues. Can a parent arrange regular follow-up with the coordinator or the person responsible for the IEP to have that regular communication with the student? So I think what's important here is to consider a few things. Obviously, I don't know the individual student and I don't want to go into details, but obviously there would be an assumption that if someone is dealing with an anxiety disorder or difficulty and mental health issues that need to be addressed, there would be an outside professional that would be working with the child. So one of the things would be to share those documents, as we said before. Sharing those documents is really going to give us some insight into some strategies or maybe goals that have been worked on with the student outside. I think meeting with the outside services and the school team, whether that's with the coordinator, whether that's with the principal and the consultant, to look at what are the strategies that need to be transferred into the school setting. They may or may not be exactly what you use outside of the setting in your life outside of school, but there may be some things that we can transfer. So setting up a meeting if your child is struggling with anxiety for whether it's a generalized anxiety disorder or a social phobia or stress, performance anxiety, whatever the difficulty may be. I think it's important to talk about what the situation is. I think the other piece is depending on the level of the child. So if we're talking about a younger child, and this one here was specifically suggesting for a secondary student, if there was an elementary student, they may be accessing services from a variety of people within the school. So we have special education technicians who could be working with a child. And I think that may be addressed in a very different way. So in the elementary, it may be working with a technician, it may be working with a readaptation officer, depending on the need. And there may be alternatives to address maybe how to get beyond those barriers that are causing the potential stressors. For a secondary student, it depends on the school, but we do have guidance counselors in many of our schools. In some of our schools, we have academic advisors, and those people, depending on their role, may or may not be able to work more in a regular setting to be meeting with your child. It really depends on the school. And also, if there is an outside professional, arrangements can be made as long as it's I know during COVID, we had to make some very strict rules about who could be in and out of the building, but when we're working with our C3S partners in the health sector, we do have collaboration with them to allow potentially a social worker to come in and work with the child. If we're talking about just regular communication, the communication is monthly, as we mentioned before, specifically to the IEP. But you could arrange to meet with, maybe not necessarily if it's an IEP coordinator at secondary, who may be one of many teachers, maybe it's a certain subject that's causing a difficulty. Maybe you need to work in that area. So this is an area I think that's really important, because we do note in COVID, that many students are experiencing a lot higher level of anxiety than usual. So there are a lot of things that can be done in terms of reducing those barriers and creating some atmosphere that is more safe for the child. So I do think what it takes is that community discussion, that team discussion to really push those needs forward. So that's the first question. There was another question here related to, sorry, I'm just going to make sure. So if kids have a speech and language therapist or help within the school, I'm assuming we're talking about within the school. If it's someone who is in private practice, that may be one thing. But if it is a person who is working within our school board and they're seeing a speech and language pathologist with us, there's a few things there. So number one, if they are working with a speech and language pathologist within our school board, there is already an intervention plan specific to the speech and language goals that are being worked on. So that's one piece. And they may or may not be essential items for the IEP. They might be. It may be the one big barrier that if, we worked on these language goals, that would create a successful environment for the child. So in that case, maybe they would be a goal that would be appropriate. If, for example, it was an articulation goal, maybe it needs to stay within the intervention plan in the practices that we do on a daily basis, but the IEP goals could look a little different. So they don't necessarily have to be the same goals. They could be other ones. Maybe it's how they use language in a social setting or in terms of interaction with peers or with adults or making requests. It really depends. If it's a private speech and language pathologist, we would, in my mind, would hope that we would have the latest report or update or goals, and we would take the same considerations in incorporating or not the goals that were outlined from the speech and language pathologist privately. Like I said, it may not be the exact same goal, but it may be a language goal or how we interact, how we socialize, how that language impacts our ability in terms of academics. So I do think that it needs to be involved. It just depends on how that is going to work itself out between the professionals. Those are two of the questions. Do Cindy or Andrea have anything to add to that for those two?
No, I think you've covered it.
Okay. There was another question here. We're kind of just going to go back and forth. If interrupt me if you need to, Andrea or Cindy, because this is a little more of an informal point. We're not obviously talking to people, so it's a little more challenging. We were hoping for that option, but it didn't play itself out. Okay, so here's a good question. So my child works with a therapist outside of school, and we need that therapist to work with the school to help them reach certain goals. So what is the process to involve that therapist at the school? So the same as we would for a speech and language pathologist. Number one, if it's a therapist that's working outside the school, it's really important, number one, to share that report with the school team so that they can understand what the context is, what the goals are, what the strategies are that are being implemented. And then it would really look at what is it that we can involve and include within either the IEP or within the context of the classroom. So if they're working on social goals, or if it's a behavioral therapist that is working on replacing maybe maladaptive behaviors with more positive behaviors, then how can we help to incorporate that in the IEP? But there's definitely a space for a therapist to collaborate with the school team on common goals. I think that is definitely possible. I'm just moving down.
Sorry, Lisa.
Yes.
I would just comment. So the question is, what is the process? So
process, yeah.
Yeah, the process would be to contact the school, contact the principal and the resource teacher and the teacher, and maybe set up a request that a meeting be put in place to discuss your options. Oftentimes I've sat in many meetings with outside professionals as well, where we've even done a Teams meeting, and the professional that your child is working with privately will also do a Teams meeting with the school and would go over some goals and strategies that they would like to see maybe practiced or implemented into the IEP. And we would try and keep in good communication there and with you, so that we're all working on the same page. So definitely contact the school.
Yeah. Okay, I see another one here that is maybe more of a comment than a question, but it's good feedback. And so someone has sent in a comment that says, we would like to have information, or we would it says we would like to see that life skills pathways or modified pathways for that matter be transparently. The parents are advised that they may be there may be a barrier to getting into certain higher levels of post-secondary education, and obviously that needs to be clear. So we do work pretty hard with families when psychological assessments are made available to look at all the options in terms of academics. When a child is quite young and receives a diagnosis of a moderate to severe intellectual disability, that information is shared quite openly in terms of the psychologist that would have been working with the child, in terms of the difficulties or limitations that may be, or the learning challenges that the child may have long term. And sometimes we're not really thinking when a child is really young about what it's going to look like, 10 years, 12 years down the road when they're now 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. A 5-year-old child, that conversation may have started, but having the full conversation down the road is obviously. So I take that with thank you for the feedback, that keeping that transparency and the honesty is important moving forward. One thing I would note is that the two IEPs, the regular and the modified, do clearly state actually the high school leaving certificate that is going to be obtained. So in the regular, as was stated, the regular one is actually a high school diploma, academic diploma, and the other one is a work training skills certificate. And once again, I take that feedback well. Thank you very much. We do try to do that, and maybe there, in this situation, maybe it wasn't well defined, but I appreciate that comment. The life skills pathway, because a child who has I say child, but at that point they're a young adult, has an intellectual disability, and the pathway has been very different. The programming is very different from the regular academic pathway. In the last 3 years of education, so a child with an intellectual disability has the ability, or the option is not the right word, but they are eligible to stay till the age of 21 if there is an appropriate program available to them. And so many of our students with intellectual disabilities do stay till the age of 21. And in those last 3 years of before they transfer on to the world outside of school, they have what is called, in French they call it TEVA, T-E-V-A, and TEVA stands for Transition de l'école à la vie active, so moving from the transition from school to an active life. And that is when the planning actually starts to take place with the outside services, with the C3S in your region, to make those links and connections to what opportunities lie outside of school for a child with an intellectual disability. So it is usually very, very well defined what those opportunities are, because there are opportunities for those individuals beyond school. Okay, here's another question. Can a child change from one pathway to another over the years? And yes, one thing I think the Ministry of Education has done really well is they've tried to create open doors at different points. So if a child is on a regular academic pathway and they're moving towards an academic diploma, there are other, options, but typically we would be reaching for that academic diploma if they have been continuously progressing along that path. Many students not many students, but students who don't obtain their high school diploma by the time they turn 18 actually can then go on to an adult ed sector and take the remaining courses in the adult sector. And obviously students can go in potentially even after grade 10 to some of the vocational programs in our school board. As for modified into regular or modified into, we wouldn't typically have a student going from modified into life skills unless maybe there was not a clear diagnosis of the intellectual disability. But students who are in a modified program, there is the potential, should there be significant changes. It's not typical that we would see a child moving from a modified to a regular pathway if that decision has been made. When a student's on a modified pathway, they typically follow that pathway down to the work-oriented training pathway and out to the world of work or the other options that we had outlined. But it's not completely impossible to move from that pathway into another one. So there is another program that we didn't define, and it's somewhat between the regular and the modified. It is a regular program, and it's the SST. So we talked about pre-work, but there's an SST program which is semi-skilled trade. And the semi-skilled trade is for students who are over the age of 15 and who have obtained at least grade 6 levels, so they're working in the grade 7 and 8 range, but they still haven't passed the core subjects in grade 8, so they're not quite ready to go into grade 9. We have had students that go from modified into the SST program, so this semi-skilled trade, and those two programs differ in that the pre-work program is a 3-year program, and the SST is a 1-year program. So these are all options, I think, that if you're ever in a situation, it is complex in terms of which program leads to what, but that's why we have those individual conversations with families, and that's really important because it really differs from one student to a next. If a student has autism, we know that students with autism learn at a very irregular path. They don't take a straight and narrow learning trajectory, and often we have dips and peaks and valleys and lots of curveballs that get thrown, and students learn at very different paces. And so a student on the autism spectrum may learn very differently, and so we need to follow that path where the child is leading us. So we have had students on the autism spectrum who have even started in a life skills program because in the early years, maybe their communication skills were quite limited and have progressed up to high school diploma. So we've had lots of different scenarios, and I think what's clear is we need to be open to those opening of doors for our students. So those are conversations that you will have, not 1 year, but it needs to happen over the course of time. I don't know if there's anything else to add there, ladies. I know I talk a lot. Where can I find my child's IEP in the parent portal? Good question. It's not actually in the parent portal. I'm going to alert you to, in the coming years, with the parent portal, there are some changes that are coming from the Ministry of Education in terms of IEPs. So IEPs aren't going anywhere, but the format may change. And what we're really working with right now is to determine when and how and what it would look like if we link those up to the parent portal. But for now, no, we cannot access the IEP through the parent portal. It is the hope for down the road. Whether that's 1, 2, 3 years, I'm not really certain. I don't really have much say in how quickly that happens, but that is the ultimate goal, is that eventually parents will be able to access that document right there in that portal. So good question. Sorry, I'm just going to read. Okay, this question here is a little bit more particular in terms of, we have a parent who's asked a question about the M in terms of the goals that have been set for their child, and how those goals being measured, how is it showing me that end, a year-end report that shows me how the goals have been measured. And so it depends on the goal. What we often want to see in terms of the goal or the objective is, what do we want to see in the child at that point, at the end of the year? What is it that we want to see the child doing? And so measuring is a tricky one, because if we were measuring based on a level, so you move from point A to point B, or you move from point A to point D, that is very easy to track. But measuring behavioral changes, that can often be tricky. So I know that measurement is maybe not as clear as it always appears to be, and it's sometimes very subjective in terms of the qualitative as opposed to the quantitative. If we were looking at marks on a test, on a standardized test over time, that would be very easy to measure. If we looked at something in terms of a behavior, the frequency of a behavior, that could be a part of a goal, but it may not be the main goal. It might not be about, let's reduce it from 3 of this down to 1 of one behavior in a given time. The measurement, I would have to agree that it's not always as clear, but really it's about what are we looking for in the child, and it may not be so much about counting or seeing the accuracy necessarily, but what is the qualitative piece that is being measured. So what are the qualities, what are the strategies, what are the skills that are necessary? So are they present, are they not? Those are the kinds of soft skills that we're looking at for kids. Andrea or Cindy, do you have anything to add to that? It's a good question, because it isn't always about counting. It isn't always about measuring specifically.
No, I think I agree with everything that you've said, and I think it's also, we have to consider it in terms of progress, not necessarily always in measuring, because as you said, that can be difficult. But no, I can understand the point as well from this from the question. Okay. The next one is about the link. How will the link be available, the recording? I think we're going to do it in a few different ways. I'm going to make the link available in a newsletter to schools so that principals can send it out to parents. I think we'll also have the link available and have it posted on the website as a recording that can be accessed for parents. So it will be available in a variety of ways, but the website is probably going to be the most constant. So it will be on the website under complementary services. They're in the process of changing the website. It's going to be updated in the next little few days. So it will make its way there under complementary services and resources for parents, under whatever that looks like at the time. And the PDF of the recording, what I'll do is make sure that the PDF will be made available to schools, and I'll make sure that it's on the website as well. There's no issue with that. Okay. Ladies, I don't know what how we're doing for time. A couple of these are more comments. I know I'm not going to get to all of these because there's quite a few questions here. Disabilities. There's a question here I don't actually understand. It's about disabilities. If this person can maybe clarify a little bit more, but something about the links and addresses, not the links in colors. I'm not sure I understand. I'm not sure I understand, sorry. I'm not sure if it's just the fact that they have to click on the link and it might not always work. So having the actual, maybe the name of the document or the name of the referenced item I think that's what they're asking, but maybe they can add another question at the end just to clarify.
Okay, there's a couple questions that are more pertaining to the presentation format, so but I'm going to look forward down to see if there's any more about what if there is a difference between when a student is having difficulty learning the material and a teacher's style of teaching may be different and not maybe not I don't want to say matching, but that students having a difficulty learning material may be due to a teaching style as opposed to an ability. Everyone learns things differently as well as people teach things differently. So it is very true that even between the three ladies that are here in front of you right now, we're three teachers and we definitely have a different approach probably in the way in which we teach. But I think that's that whole role in terms of communicating with the teacher to make sure that we look at different options and different. You also can look at, there are other people in the school, right? So there are resource teachers that are available to support teachers as well that look at those different options in terms of, does a student need to work more independently? Do they need to be more tactile? Do they need to have things more visual? And resource teachers have lots of resources to support different types of learners. Okay, so one is about maybe an individual parent's difficulty with communication and maybe not having a communication early on. So teachers, I think what we mentioned was that teachers in the first weeks of September are really getting familiar with all of the students and that they have. At the secondary level, obviously, there's a lot more students. And so the resource team is really important there in terms of getting, that connection with the team. So reaching out early and when the IEP, if it's a larger school, maybe there's a coordinator, maybe there's a key person, or perhaps it's the principal if it's a smaller school. It depends. And does the school work with the CLSC or La Resource for types of services, speech and occupational therapy? So this isn't specific to the IEP, but in terms of collaborating for the IEP, the sharing of resources and reports is obviously very important. And so we may once again not have the exact same goals, but we definitely do work with the professionals that would be involved with your child. And we do have an entente to collaborate on services. So the CLSC workers are not all coming in to work in our schools, obviously. Social workers may, but obviously their mandate may be more specific to the home environment as opposed to the school environment. So it really depends on what the situation is. So looking at, somebody's asked a question about equipment and if someone has a diagnosis of a learning disability or a writing or reading disability. So we did note that for the IEP that special exam conditions, depending on the diagnosis, would be identified in the IEP, and the IEP does state those things. So a child would have access to a laptop. If, for example, it's a child with a writing and reading disability, they would have access for those special exam conditions, which does include the assistive technology. So they may access a school board computer or a school computer, depending on the need. Okay, I think we're just about coming up to, well, we've definitely gone longer than the 15 minutes. I see there's quite a few more questions here. There's about 7 more questions. So I'll just see if there's any that repeat. Okay. These are more or less, not so much questions about IEPs and more questions that are individual in terms of wait lists and so on. So where can I find my child's IEP? Sorry, my light going out again. Your child's IEP, well, if you don't have a copy of the IEP, I think during COVID it's been a little different. We've had to send IEPs home in a PDF format, but you can have access to your child's IEP. All you have to do is communicate with the teacher and ask for a copy. I'm sure that they can make a printed copy for you if you don't have one. If in the spring when we're writing the new IEPs, like I said, during COVID, there's been a lot of changes in the past 2 years, really, for IEPs in terms of hard copies, signing copies, and so on. And those I would presume that once COVID has moved on, that we look at returning to the old practice of having parents in the buildings, meeting with parents and teachers, and signing of documents, and whatever format that takes. But there should be an IEP available to you, and if you don't have a copy, you just reach out to your school, and I'm sure that they'll make a copy for you. If you don't have a copy of this year's IEP, you need to reach out and request that. Okay, so we've got one question here about does access to an aide if they have an IEP. So if I have an IEP, does my child have an aide? And I'm assuming what you mean is a person that's going to support your child, so an attendant working with them. What is the process in order to have access to an attendant? And so an attendant would specifically be assigned to a student who has met a particular criteria or need or a diagnosis identified in the ministry's terminology as a handicap or a limitation or an impairment. So what we would want to do is obviously the attendants are working with identified special needs student. That does not mean a specific learning disorder would require an attendant. A specific learning disorder would potentially be more of a student that would have an IEP with conditions that would support their learning. So they're really two different criteria. So an IEP does not mean that you're going to have an attendant sitting with or supporting your child on a daily basis. But there's lots of different ways that a child can be supported in a classroom. It could be in individual sessions with a teacher or a resource teacher. It could be small group instruction. It could be differentiated instruction. It could be a lot of different adaptations that are in place. It definitely doesn't necessarily need to be an attendant. Okay. And I think I addressed the last question, which was really asking about what types of remediation for a child in an IEP who has a reading disability. So once again, remediation can take a lot of different forms. It can be done by the classroom teacher. It can be done by a resource teacher. There's lots of different ways and interventions, whether that's the programming that has been done in terms of a daily 5 situation where teachers are working around with smaller groups of students working on specific goals. It depends on the situation, but there's lots of things that can be done in terms of remediation to help improve learning difficulties over time. So in terms of questions, I have actually been able to answer all of those that pertain to IEPs. The other questions, some people were concerned about not seeing the questions published. I didn't publish them all. Some of them actually had some information that was related to a school, and I won't be publishing those, but we'll see whether or not we could potentially, what I think might be helpful is we can compile the questions as an aside document that could be attached so that managing all of the publishing, and so what is called is publishing, is a little challenging. So I think what we'll do is we'll look at the questions. I have answered as many of the questions as I could that were related to IEPs, and the others, I apologize if I missed one, but some of them were more related to the format in which I am sharing, and that the presentation is gone. So hopefully we've answered all the questions that you may have had. We still have most people, that's great. And I really thank you all for coming tonight. It's really helpful to ensure that we're having that collaborative platform to work with parents and families to make sure that we can provide the best environment for our children to, and your children to progress. So hopefully you found this evening helpful, and I wish you all the best. And we're going to close off there. Anything last words, Cindy or Andrea?
Nope. Maybe
Nope.
I'll be working with some of my parents in the future if you're attending tonight. And I have no problem answering any other questions. So I'll look forward to meeting you.
Oops. Okay, so thank you so much, and I'll close off the session. Thanks again. Take care.